Hiring managers of Reddit, what's the most strange or cringe-worthy thing a potential candidate has said or done during the interview? I actually did this cause I was nervous. Is this a picture of your wife? She is beautiful. That is my 14-year-old daughter. Nice, nice. When asked about strengths and weaknesses, the candidate replied, I crave KFC and often get myself a bargain bucket. I just didn't know what to say next, let alone whether they considered it a strength or a weakness. Not a hiring manager, but at a place I worked at, they were passing around an application of a guy who had to state that he had been convicted of a felony. He explained that a drunk driver killed his son, so he murdered the guy, was out on parole. I felt bad. My first management job in it was around 2001 or so. Hiring a general Windows/Solaris sysadmin. One guy comes in with a huge backpack. Do the interview. He's clearly on the spectrum, but I like him okay. Pretty smart, functional. As he's leaving, I casually ask, what's in your bag? He then explains that it's mostly really books that he brings to all his interviews, so he can prove people wrong if he needs to. After a pretty terrible interview for a level 1 help desk role, me, is there anything you want to ask us, or anything else you wish to say? Them, well, I know the director. He said he'd look after me. Leans back and folds arms. He didn't get the job, and we advised the director of his comments. Me, can you tell me about the gap in 2010 to 12? Them, I took time out to work on myself. Me, okay, so can you tell me why you left your last position? Them, I was asked to leave, and I have to disclose this. I embezzled from them. Me, so, did you work on yourself in prison between 2010 to 2012? Them, I don't think that's important. Now I Google people every single time before I interview them. I interviewed a leprechaun once. He was a short, somewhat overweight guy that was of Irish descent, had red hair and a beard. He chose to wear of all things a green suit to the interview. It was hard to keep a straight face, especially when my interviewing partner mentioned a rainbow table, cryptography, and said our code was gold standard, and lamented the construction going on at the Cloverleaf exit near the office. Asked a candidate about previous job experience, working for a company that made and sold prosthetic limbs. Oh, I was so passionate about it. I just loved it so much that I wanted to run out in the street and cut people's arms and legs off just so they could experience our product. We had a girl come in for an interview who brought her boyfriend. He didn't wait in the car. He actually wanted to sit in on the interview with her. When I explained that it wasn't protocol and he'd have to at least wait in the break room, he actually got angry at me. She wasn't a bad candidate, but I didn't want to risk anything to do with her boyfriend leading into our office. I've had some ridiculous interviews. One older white woman said, "Will I have to work with Middle Easterners?" And she pointed to a guy outside the meeting room. The guy was of Indian heritage, but was born here. I said, "Oh, Mike's not from the Middle East." Her in a whisper, "You know what I mean. Brown people. I work for a tech company." Another guy seems nice during introductions, and then I ask my first question. "That's your first question? You're not going to ask about the break in my experience?" Me, "No. I care about whether you can do this job, not what you've done the past year." Him, "But why wouldn't you ask that first?" Me, "Because I want to know about the work you did at this other company." Him, "Well, I wrote a novel, you know, and it got published. Did you Google me and know that already?" Me, "I Googled you, didn't see anything about a novel, and that isn't pertinent here. Can you address the question?" Him, "The movie rights were optioned. I've just finished my second novel. I'm looking for a publisher. Want to know what it's about?" Me, "Not right now. Maybe la." Him, "It's this great story." Me, "I'm sorry, you're going to have to leave. If you can't tell me about your practical experience, you're not suited for this role." At my previous job, I was interviewing candidates for a position within my team. One of the applicants was internal, so I knew of her and knew she had a few cats as pets. So the day of the interview arrives, in she comes, and we start with the basics. I then ask a few competency-based questions, and she starts to give answers, not based on her work experience. She had trained overseas teams and had an impressive CV, but relating the answers back to her cats. For example, I asked, can you give me an example of your leadership skills? I shit you not, her answer was along the lines of, well, I have 2 cats, and around feeding time I need to make sure cat 1 gets fed first as cat 2 has a weight problem and will try to eat cat 1's food. I need to ensure I lead by making sure cat 2 is kept well away from cat 1 until he's finished his food. She then showed me pictures of the cats in question. Don't get me wrong, they were some mighty fine beasts. Cat 2 was a fat old fuck, and I have a pet cat, but I was a bit surprised. I did get some decent answers from her on occasion, but it was a very surreal interview. She didn't get the job. He said he was going out back to smoke a bowl after we were done and asked if I'd like to join him. I personally don't smoke and have no problem with people who do, but until it's legalized in our state, keep that shit to yourself during job interviews. Once a guy came for interview and his old class fellows were already working with me. I heard his friends were calling him dildo and he was responding to it normally. So the new guy walks into my office while I was about to leave. Me, have a seat, dildo. I shall talk to you in a minute. He was surprised and everyone in office had good laugh. First thing he did was told me his name immediately. He was hired. I was once really nervous at the end of my job interview and for some reason decided to stroke one of the office plants as the hiring manager walked me to the exit. Then I laughed awkwardly and said in a surprised tone, "They're real." He was not impressed and I did not get the job. I only witnessed this because I'm not a hiring manager, but this dude tried to take his mom in an interview with him. Obviously the guy said, "I would like to interview the applicant one-on-one please," and this bitch threw a fit and stormed out with her son. My favorite was when I had to interview this total bro. So many cringe-worthy interview mess-ups I had to hold myself in from laughing. When asked about dealing with difficult customers, he mentions how he hated dealing with shitty brown people with long-ass last names. Alright, it wasn't during an interview, but a kid looking to get hired at my store came in and asked to speak to me. I was out the day he came in, so he asked my coworkers the next day I would be there and planned to come back. Well, 2 days later, when I was back, he came back with his grandmother. Now this didn't bother me at first because we have hired some kids who were too young to drive but had a good head on their shoulders. What did bother me is when the kid stood by the door and the grandmother came to talk to me alone. She started having the interview for him when I didn't even plan on giving the kid an interview yet. She handed me a resume that I'm fairly sure she designed in Paint and started spouting off all these really admirable traits about this kid. Meanwhile, he stood by the door and looked straight down at his shoes. She told me what a hard worker he was, how quick of a learner he was, and because this was a retail job she tried to tell me how personable he was. I shit you not, this lady looked me dead in the eyes with her grandson standing 50 feet away and tried to tell me he was great with people and that he had no problems approaching anyone. I was stunned. I kindly told her that I would keep his resume on file, but at the moment we were not looking for any new employees. So she thanks me and shakes my hand and walks over to her grandson. She whispers something in his ear and he walks over to me. He doesn't say a word and just sticks his hand out at me. I went to shake his hand, but I'm not entirely sure he understood the concept of a handshake. I was grabbing his hand and shaking while he just let his limp, clammy hand sit in my grasp until it was over. He then turned around and left. Obligatory, not my job, but my boss is a hiring manager and has a great one. He received not a resume with like bullet points and things you've done in past positions, but a first-person narrative giving an account of the applicant's viewing of the storming of the Bastille. The entire thing used flowery, extravagant language to describe the overthrowing of, a 1700s French prison, but then gave how that was very much like their proficiency at Word and Excel and their history of promptness. This was for an entry-level assistant's position. Recent college grads and the like. They didn't get the gig. There are a couple I remember. Guy showed up drunk for an operations manager interview. Short perfunctory interview followed by a "don't call us, we'll call you." Guy showed up in a tie and suit vest for a near minimum wage unskilled labor job. Got the job. Turned out to be a pretty good worker. Interviewing for general manager while shaking my hand before the interview begins. "I'll have your job someday." Offered him a ops supervisor position instead. He took it. Didn't last long. And the cardinal sin of interview behavior. I've seen this too often to recall all of them. Interviewee bitches about previous employer being an idiot or bigot. Still makes me cringe every time. I also vividly remember this one. We were interviewing to fill a bunch of low-level positions, forklift operators and the like, in a warehouse. One of the candidates shows up late, rugged looking, sweaty. We had already filled the positions, so my manager meets with him to explain. She comes into my office crying, because it turns out this guy walked 3 hours to get here as he is, and I mean completely broke. When she turned him away he started crying. Nothing quite like seeing a grown man pushed to the limit finally break down and cry. We felt really bad for him, had a quick meeting to create a new position, and when we went to tell him he'd left, that one still haunts me. I have a funny story about a guy we hired a couple of months ago. This guy had been working from home for a couple years and had gained some weight. He wore the suit he was married in for the interview with the senior guy here and bent over to pick up something, and his pants split down the rear. Needless to say he got the job. I was on an interview committee for an IT position, and I had shaggy longish hair at the time. This kid comes in, has a pretty terrible interview, but he's confident the whole time. When we asked him if he had any questions or comments, he looked at me and said, "I came in and saw your hair, and I can't believe they actually hire people like you." He was probably nervous, and I think his intention was to say that he's glad we don't just hire the typical professional looking type. Unfortunately for him, it did not come off that way. Okay, not a hiring manager, but the most cringe-worthy thing I did in a job interview yet was in an interview for a team leader position at Six Flags. The hiring manager asked me where I see myself in 10 years, and I told her head of operations of Six Flags Surreal. At the time, I just got back in the US after being in Europe for 3 years. What I didn't know was Surreal has been closed and all the rides were sold off and moved to other parks. She corrected me right away, and that was the end of the interview. I didn't get the job. Had a guy apply for a part-time sales position. He put a few random sales jobs as his work history. We called him in for an interview. He sat in front of me and said, "I'm not here for the part-time position I applied for, I'm here for the general manager position and that's all I'm taking." Okay, we are done here, thanks. Number 1, we weren't hiring for a GM. I joked with my GM about him secretly leaving and not telling me. Number 2, you lied on your resume and job app, which means I'm not even going to look at your next apps that you put through if the spot were to be available again. Number 3, you don't come in demanding a spot. From the other side of the table, I was interviewing for a tech writing position at an engineering company. The first part of the interview with the communications manager went really well, and she brought me in to speak to the head of engineering. He asked me lots of questions about organizing documentation and where what sections would go and why. At one point he starts asking about cars. He then wanted me to write a list of all the different parts of a car and, after completion of my list, separate them into sections, something like safety, use, maintenance, etc. So I start listing parts, and he keeps telling me to keep adding to it. Eventually I filled the whole page, and he keeps telling me to continue. I maybe know slightly more about cars than the average 20-something woman, but am by no means a car aficionado. This job has nothing to do with cars. I'm confused. I have no idea what this list is missing. Eventually, I tell him so. He looks me dead in the eyes and explains that I forgot to list wheels. My very extensive list of car parts has no wheels. Certain that I've bombed the interview for this very obvious and stupid oversight anyway, I replied, "It's a hovercraft." I got the job.